Sociology of Immigration. Immigration is a two-stage process. First, an individual emigrates, decides to leave their home country to settle in another. In so doing, the individual becomes an expatriate, or someone who lives outside their home country. Immigration is the natural result of emigration. Large population flows across international borders can create a so-called diaspora, the spread of people living outside of their native homeland. More helpful terms. The sending country refers to the home country from which one emigrates. The receiving or host country refers to the one into which one immigrates. The word immigrant is inexact and can sometimes be used to refer to people who were born in the host country and thus technically aren't immigrants at all. First-generation immigrant is the term that refers to those who are foreign-born and often settle in the host country when they are adults or teenagers. Such individuals may struggle more to assimilate to the new culture and learn the language, though not always. Second and subsequent generation immigrants are born in the host country. Technically, in the United States, these people aren't immigrants at all. Rather, they are citizens, at least at the time of this recording. We'll get to that later. But because they grew up in a household with first-gen parents, their experiences may be a little different. They may be more likely to be bilingual, say speaking English at school but Spanish at home, as well as bicultural. For example, observing both U.S. holidays like Thanksgiving, but also Vietnamese ones like Tet. Second-gen people may share other kinds of experiences that set them apart. Having to help interpret for their parents, or growing up separated from extended family members. So they may be seen and even think of themselves as immigrants, even if they were born here. Sometimes scholars of immigration will talk about a 1.5 generational group. These are usually people who were born abroad but settled in the host country as children, and thus will likely speak English and navigate U.S. culture more like a second gen or any other native-born person. Other important concepts. People migrate as a result of both push and pull factors. Push factors are factors that drive people to leave their homelands: war, famine, discrimination, etc. Whereas pull factors are things that make resettlement elsewhere seem appealing or necessary: better jobs, freedom from persecution, etc. The picture, by the way, shows men recruited to work in the United States. Work is a major pull factor for global migration, under the auspices of something called the Bracero program. We'll talk about that soon, too. The U.S. has traditionally referred to itself as a nation of immigrants, and we are. The United States receives more immigrants annually in total than any other country on Earth. In 2023, the U.S. foreign-born population was 47.8 million people. That's about 14.3% of our total population, which is about 330 million people. Mexico is our top sending country, accounting for about 23%, followed by India at about 6% of those, China at 5%, the Philippines at 4%, and El Salvador at 3%. This period in U.S. history is one with relatively high immigration, but it isn't the highest. The peak period of immigration into the United States was between the years of 1860 and 1920, at least in the era when anyone was keeping track. In 1890, the foreign-born represented about 14.8% of our population. And though we like to think of ourselves as the world's leading nation of immigrants, other countries could dispute that. We receive more total migrants each year than any other country, at least as of 2024, but our population is also huge. We're the third most populous country on Earth. Other countries actually admit more people annually relative to their total population size. In Canada, for example, 23% of the population is foreign-born or first generation. In Germany, it's close to 20%. In Australia, it's close to 1/3. Nevertheless, it's clear that immigration over the past several hundred years has had a major influence on what is now the United States. This is a super cool map published using census data. It shows the largest single ancestry by county, designated by color. Some notable takeaways. That big light blue mass throughout Pennsylvania and the Midwest, and also parts of Texas, are people who identify their ancestry as German. Germans are the largest self-reported ancestral group in the United States. Germany alone is thought to have contributed over 7 million migrants to the United States between the colonial period and the early 1900s. During the peak immigration wave from Germany, as much as 1/3 of the total population of what is now Germany picked up and moved to the United States. They left as a result of push factors like religious persecution, driving out Protestants, Catholics, and Jews in turn, a lack of economic opportunities, and political and civil unrest, and came here due to pull factors like jobs, available farmland, and as more and more people left places like the Rhineland or Bavaria and settled in places like Wisconsin and Texas for family reunification. Germans are the first largest ancestry in the United States. African Americans, shown in dark purplish red and still heavily concentrated in the South, are the second. People who mostly self-identify as Mexican or Spanish are shown in salmon pink. They tend to be concentrated in border regions as well as throughout California and the western states. It's useful to note that this is not all due to immigration. Hispanic majority communities are still concentrated in territory that belonged to Mexico before the Mexican-American War. This land, including Texas, was ceded to the United States in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which means that many of the ancestors of today's Hispanic Americans didn't cross over the U.S. border at all. The border crossed over them. Native American majority counties are shown in light orange. This is the one population that experienced a dramatic decrease over past centuries. We don't know how many Native Americans were in the United States before colonization. Estimates range from 8 million to over 100 million. There were no official censuses. But today, they number below 3 million people. One mystery. The buff color, seen concentrated heavily in the South, identifies itself simply as American. This probably means they have no salient memory of themselves as descendants of Germans, English, Scandinavians, etc. And in fact, every year, the number of people who identify simply as Americans increases. Migrants are more likely to settle in some places than others. The two states with the largest migrant populations include California and Texas. Other states with large foreign-born populations include New York, Florida, Nevada, and others. By the way, counts of foreign-born people include authorized migrants, those here on visas, for example, people who are foreign-born but have since naturalized, meaning gone through the process of becoming citizens, as shown here in this sweet Houston Chronicle photo of a 2023 naturalization ceremony in Aldine, north of Houston. And they also attempt to include accurate counts of people who are undocumented or unauthorized, people who have come in on a legitimate visa but overstayed, for example, as well as so-called EWIs, entry without inspection, people who enter the United States by illicitly crossing a border. Unauthorized people are more challenging to count, but the U.S. Census Bureau does have ways of estimating their population size. Houston and surrounding communities are more diverse, both ethnically and in terms of immigration status, than Texas and most of the United States as a whole. In the greater Houston area, almost 1 in 3 people are foreign-born. Houston is one of the most diverse major metro regions in the country, and as this infographic from the Kinder Institute shows, at Rice, a city where there is no majority group, meaning no group that holds 50% or more of the population. And here's where they come from. These data, showing the top 12 sending countries of first-generation Houston residents, are from the 2015 census, so they may be a little out of date by the time you watch this. But they do give a good snapshot of the overwhelming diversity of our city. Mexico is in first place, but we also have large populations of people from Asia, Central and South America, Africa, and so on. The census counts the number of undocumented immigrants in the United States using something called the residual method. The census traditionally doesn't ask if you're here legally, but they do ask if you're foreign-born. With this method, the known number of legally documented immigrants in the United States is subtracted from the reported U.S. Census number of self-proclaimed foreign-born people, based on immigration records and adjusted by projections of death and outmigration to obtain the total. Since it's estimated that the census will still have difficulty reaching or gaining compliance from unauthorized immigrants, they also do a little math to account for a presumed undercount of about 10%. For this reason, stats on the number of undocumented people living in the United States can vary from research org to research org. Nevertheless, there are approximately 11 million undocumented migrants in the United States, representing about 3.3% of the total U.S. population, and a little under a quarter of the foreign-born population. About 37% are estimated to be from Mexico. After Mexico, the top sending countries were El Salvador, India, Guatemala, and Honduras. U.S. states with the largest undocumented populations are California, Texas, and Florida, and U.S. counties with the largest undocumented populations are Los Angeles County in first place and our own Harris County in second. Whether a first-generation immigrant is documented or undocumented, their children, if born in the United States, have traditionally been granted something called birthright citizenship. There are different ways that a child's citizenship can be determined. The first is called jus soli, or right of soil. That's Latin, jus meaning law or right, soli meaning soil. It basically refers to place of birth. If you received your citizenship as a result of being born on U.S. soil, regardless of who your parents are, you are a citizen through the principle of jus soli. The U.S. isn't the only country that recognizes unconditional jus soli citizenship. Canada, Mexico, and most of the rest of Central and South America do, as well as a handful of other countries in the world. The second type is jus sanguinis, or right of blood. This type of citizenship is inherited from one's parents. The U.S. recognizes this too. If a child is born overseas to a U.S. citizen, that child will also qualify for U.S. citizenship, following the principle of jus sanguinis, provided either parent has legally resided in the United States prior to the child's birth. Texas Senator Ted Cruz was born in Canada, for example, but since his mother was a U.S.-born citizen, he inherited his citizenship status through her. He also received Canadian citizenship, following their principle of jus soli, but he renounced that in 2013. In the United States, our recognition of birthright citizenship is grounded in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. This is one of the Reconstruction Amendments, passed after the end of the Civil War, to affirm the right of freed enslaved people to the rights and protections of citizenship that had previously been denied to them. It expressly overturned the Supreme Court's ruling in Dred Scott v. Sanford, an 1857 case wherein the court held that people of African descent imported as slaves, or their descendants, whether slave or free, were not protected by the Constitution and could never be citizens. Dred Scott was a slave that sued for freedom for himself and his family on the grounds that he had been transported by the family that legally owned him to a free territory, and his daughters were also born in that free territory, and thus Scott argued that he, or at least his daughters, should be freed. The court said no, that slaves were property, and that stripping a slaveholder of his slaves was tantamount to depriving him of his property without due process. But the 14th Amendment specifically nullified that, stating that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to its laws are citizens of the United States and the state where they live. This amendment is an important one because it also affirms the rights to both due process and equal protection, holding that, quote, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. The legal concept of birthright citizenship, as something that everyone born on U.S. soil was entitled to, regardless of race or ancestry, created an interesting tension with naturalization law for a long time. Naturalization means the legal process by which a foreign national becomes a citizen of their new country. The first attempt to define naturalization rights in the United States came in 1790. In the Naturalization Act of 1790, Congress decreed that aliens, foreign-born immigrants, would be eligible for naturalization only if they were free white people who had resided in the United States for at least 2 years and could prove to a common law court in the state where they lived that they were of good character. In reality, this meant that naturalization tended to be limited to property-owning white men. The Naturalization Act of 1790 stayed in effect up until 1952, and during that time blocked millions of first generation people who the courts decided were not white or not white enough from becoming citizens. There are many critics of jus soli citizenship in the United States. Many claim that it incentivizes undocumented people to come to the United States in order to have children here, either so that their child can have a better life as a U.S. citizen, and or so that their U.S. citizen child could someday sponsor them for U.S. citizenship, though the parents would have to wait until that child was at least 21 to even start that process. Some critics also argue that birthright citizenship language of the 14th Amendment was only ever supposed to apply to freed slaves. The Supreme Court actually disagreed about that, though. At the turn of the century, few immigrant groups were as persecuted and maligned in the United States as migrants from China and other Asian nations. The Chinese, who emigrated in large numbers to the U.S. starting in the 1850s, were drawn by the pull factor of work, specifically work in the mines, factories, and agriculture. They were also instrumental in building the railroads that connected U.S. regions to one another, work that created immense economic wealth for at least some Americans. But there are also backlashes from others who accused them of taking American jobs, of crowding into American cities and living in impoverished squalor, and even of engaging in drug and sex trafficking. Ugly rumors spread that accused Chinese men of kidnapping white women and girls and forcing them into prostitution, and or of trafficking opium into the United States in order to undermine the country by ensnaring good, hardworking Americans into a web of addiction. If you pay attention to political discourse today, you can hear some of these same accusations occasionally being leveled against other immigrant communities. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first significant immigration law in U.S. history that singled out a specific racial or ethnic group for exclusion, although wealthier Chinese people and diplomats could still gain admission. U.S. employers that relied on Chinese workers simply shrugged and started recruiting workers from elsewhere, Mexico and other parts of Asia like the Philippines. Chinese migration to the United States dropped off significantly, though many Chinese migrants simply adapted by traveling first to Mexico and then being smuggled over the U.S.-Mexico border. Interestingly, the first U.S. border patrols on the U.S.-Mexico border were not there to prevent Mexican or South American migrants from entering the United States. At that time, they were not restricted, and they were in great demand by U.S. employers. No, the first Border Patrol officers were nicknamed Chinese catchers. Their job was to make sure Chinese migrants couldn't come in through the back door, so to speak. Human smugglers, what we call coyotes today, adapted by dressing Chinese clients in traditional Mexican clothes and teaching them to speak a little Spanish. Phrases like, yo soy Mexicano, in case they were caught. That's fascinating, but I digress. Enter Wong Kim Ark, shown here. He was a U.S.-born man in San Francisco to two Chinese parents who were ineligible for naturalization because they were not white. At age 21, Wong Kim Ark traveled to China to visit family. When he returned, however, he was denied entry, both because of the Chinese Exclusion Act and because immigration officials argued he was not a citizen. The case went to the Supreme Court, which in a 6-2 ruling held that Wong Kim Ark was a citizen, simply because he was born here. From then until now, the right of jus soli citizenship has been a fact of U.S. law. However, at the time of this recording, that is being challenged. President Donald Trump, who ran on a platform advocating for strongly restricting immigration to the United States, has made moves to end the U.S.'s legal tradition of birthright citizenship. On January 20th of 2025, the White House issued an executive order titled Protecting the Meaning and Value of U.S. Citizenship, holding that the privilege of U.S. citizenship does not automatically extend to persons born in the United States if their parents were non-U.S. citizens and or not legal permanent residents. At the time of this recording, a court has blocked the executive order from taking effect, but the Supreme Court has not yet ruled on the case. If it does go into effect, it would presumably only apply to people born after January 20th, 2025. So, what do you think? Should the U.S. continue to recognize jus soli citizenship as we have in the past, or should we limit it to children of citizens or authorized migrants? Immigration is one of the most contested issues in U.S. politics. it certainly has the power to drive voters' choices at the polls. President Trump was elected twice, partially on this issue. During his campaign for the presidency in 2016, he pledged mass deportations and the construction of a huge wall between the U.S. and Mexico. He gave speeches arguing that Mexico was sending, perhaps strategically, their murderers and rapists to the United States, along with, he averred, some fine people. He also pledged and attempted to block all migration of Muslims into the United States. The last election cycle was full of similar claims. Trump used his debates and speeches to promise the largest mass deportations in history, and to shut down a lot of lawful immigration, too. Much of his rhetoric in the last campaign cycle, and in office, has focused on undocumented immigrants, saying they were poisoning the blood of the country, and pledging to stop the, quote, plunder, rape, slaughter, and destruction of our American suburbs, cities, and towns. However, it wasn't only unauthorized immigrants that were framed as a threat. He claimed that Haitian migrants in Ohio, who are here legally, were kidnapping and eating people's cats and dogs. Given Donald Trump's political success, you'd assume that Americans as a whole are pretty anti-immigration, but it's actually more complicated than that. Gallup, one of the oldest and most respected polling firms in the United States, routinely runs surveys on this topic. At first glance, a majority of Americans seem to feel that there's too much immigration into the United States. When asked, should immigration be kept at its current level, increased, or decreased, 55% of respondents said they should be decreased. When asked, how much do you personally worry about illegal immigration, 66% said they worried about it either a great deal or a fair amount. However, in those same polls, a majority of Americans will also state that they believe immigration is largely good for the United States. When asked, do you think immigration is a good thing or a bad thing for the country today, 64% of Americans said that they thought that it was a good thing. Only 32% said that they thought that it was mostly a bad thing. And when asked how they wanted to see immigration handled by the government, a small majority of people, 51%, still said they were against mass deportation. A fairly large majority, 70%, actually say they favor a path to citizenship for undocumented migrants, maybe something similar to the amnesty programs launched by past presidents like Ronald Reagan or Barack Obama's Deferred Action Program. Why that translated into such strong electoral gains for Donald Trump could be down to a number of factors. One, given that so many Americans were concerned about immigration, they may have broken for the candidate who promised decisive action on it, even if they didn't agree with all of his principles. For example, support for expanding the border wall is at 53%, so maybe his decision to campaign on that was a draw. Two, remember, the only thing that ever matters in an election, really, is who turns out to vote. In the 2024 election, more than a third of eligible voters never bothered to show up on Election Day. A lot of those people never bothered to get registered to vote to begin with. Voter turnout tends to be higher among certain groups. For example, older people vote more than younger ones, whites are more likely to vote than most other minority groups, and wealthy people vote more regularly than poorer ones. Since these groups tend to be more conservative on a range of issues, including immigration, they may have dominated in the election by simply showing up. For those 66% of people who said they personally worried about illegal immigration, either a lot or a fair amount, what are they worried about? One major concern is crime, and Donald Trump very much campaigned on this, repeatedly making the argument that foreign countries are using U.S.-bound immigration to get rid of their criminals. Trump also brought family members of people like Laken Riley, a 22-year-old nursing student murdered by an undocumented Venezuelan man, on the campaign trail with him. In any population of 11 million people, of course, there will be criminals. However, data consistently show that undocumented people themselves commit both violent and property crimes at significantly lower rates than do citizens. A 2024 study conducted by the National Institute of Justice analyzed 7 years of arrest data in Texas and found that undocumented immigrants were arrested at less than half the rate of U.S.-born citizens for violent and drug offenses, and a quarter of the rate of U.S.-born citizens for property crime. Arrest rates are not a perfect measure of who is committing crime, but this finding is a long-standing one. Native-born people get arrested for breaking the law more frequently than legal immigrants do, with undocumented people having the lowest arrest rate of all. There is a logic to this. In a recent survey of over 3,000 foreign-born adults, jobs was the most commonly cited pull factor, followed by a better future for their children. Others cite more rights and freedoms, joining family members, and escaping unsafe conditions. The share who cite escaping unsafe conditions rises to about half of undocumented immigrants and about 6 in 10 immigrants from Central America. This makes undocumented migrants in particular highly motivated to avoid legal problems and police contact. They just have too much to lose by breaking the law. Because undocumented people are so likely to avoid police contact, though, they can be more likely to be victims of crimes compared to other groups. This chart, focusing on violent crime, shows offense rates for U.S.-born citizens, shown at the top in blue, documented or legal immigrants, in red, which is lower than U.S. citizens, and then finally at the bottom, undocumented immigrants, who have the lowest rates of all. There are certain categories of crime that only immigrants can commit. These are called immigration-related crimes, and include things like visa overstay or entry without inspection. But these are not included in most violent and property crime statistics because they are historically considered less serious offenses. Many are only classified as civil law violations or misdemeanors, for example. And when people worry about crime, they're more likely to worry about getting their house broken into or their car stolen than, say, their neighbor overstaying his student visa or their babysitter using a fake Social Security number to work. Of course, illicit activities can encourage growth of gang and organized crime. Human smuggling nets an estimated 10 billion US dollars globally each year, and smuggled migrants are at a higher risk of being trafficked. Human smuggling, remember, involves the voluntary but illicit movement of people across borders, whereas trafficking involves the use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain some type of labor or sexual exploitation. Certain kinds of drugs may be imported into the United States. For example, the majority of fentanyl sold on U.S. streets can be traced back to China and Mexico, according to the USDEA, whereas illegal firearms tend to go in the opposite direction. They're more easily purchased in the United States than elsewhere and tend to be smuggled out, helping to fuel gang violence in Mexico and Central America. Some argue that undocumented immigration must necessarily bring with it higher crime for these reasons, than the networks of illicit activity that allow unauthorized migrants to enter the United States, for example by paying human smugglers or coyotes, or work here by procuring documentation like fake Social Security cards, must necessarily mean that migrant communities will be plagued with gang crime. The data don't necessarily bear this out, though. If undocumented people brought gang activity with them, we'd expect higher rates of crime in cities with larger shares of undocumented people, or spikes of drug-related arrests as a result of concomitant drug trafficking. But we usually don't. Notably, we see the opposite. Mass settlement of immigrants, either documented or not, in lower-income neighborhoods is associated with falling crime in those neighborhoods. This leads to something called the immigrant revitalization hypothesis, which argues that this fall in crime could be due to several factors. Emigration is hard. The people who come are often stronger, more hopeful, harder working, braver, and more ambitious. An asylum seeker from Guatemala, for example, may have to walk hundreds of miles on foot, cross a heavy militarized border, and then a literal desert to get into the United States. Lazy folks don't do that. They stay home. This brain drain of the most talented and hardest working people settling into an American city can bring good things sometimes. For example, immigrants tend to start small businesses at higher rates, which can create jobs. Immigrants also tend to build strong community ties by investing in families, their neighborhoods, and social organizations like churches. Communities with stronger ties, where neighbors know each other and watch out for each other, have lower crime rates. It's possible this correlation works in the other direction too, of course. As job seekers, immigrants may be more likely to identify and head to communities where economic growth is heating up. For whatever reason, as undocumented immigrants settle into a community, crime is statistically more likely to go down. Another common fear about undocumented migrants is that they are drawn to the United States for the purposes of cheating welfare. Undocumented immigrants generally do not qualify for welfare programs like SNAP or TANF, although some categories of migrant are eligible for some temporary assistance. Refugees being actively resettled in the United States, for example, can get assistance for a short period of time. The U.S.-born citizen children of undocumented migrants can qualify for aid through programs like SNAP or food stamps. This isn't a lot of money. The average SNAP benefit per person is about $187 per month, comfortably less than the average cost of groceries per person. Undocumented immigrants are also less likely to claim benefits that their children might be eligible for, lest they risk apprehension and deportation. There are some publicly funded services that migrants do access, though. Federal law says that any hospital which receives federal money has to make certain emergency medical services available to anyone who needs them, regardless of their ability to pay or their citizenship status. So if you get shot or have a severe asthma attack, hospital ERs have to treat and stabilize you, whether you can pay or not. Undocumented migrants also have the right to enroll themselves or their kids in K-12 public schools, and those services do cost money. School districts with larger numbers of new immigrants will often spend more, for example, because they must provide ESL services. Immigrants, especially those who are undocumented or working in low-wage industries, may rely on free ER care more. However, it would be wrong to suggest that undocumented people don't pay for the public services they can access, because undocumented people pay taxes too, at least some kinds. Anyone who buys anything in the United States, ranging from gas to clothing, pays sales tax. And in Texas, sales tax is the largest single source of state revenue, accounting for close to 60%. Property taxes are a big one too, and they are the primary source of funding for public schools. If you own or rent housing in the U.S., you pay property tax. A homeowner pays it directly. For a renter, it is factored into the cost of your rent. But it's not just state or local taxes. A lot of undocumented people also pay federal taxes too. These are the kind that are usually deducted from your paycheck. You can see them on your pay stub. The reason this happens is that a fairly high proportion of unauthorized migrants use fake Social Security numbers to work. This is considered an immigration-related crime, but it's also kind of a boon for the U.S. government. The money is collected from their checks, but can't be traced back to a verified person, and so it goes into a slush fund called an earnings suspense file. The government basically keeps this money. Undocumented people can't draw Social Security or unemployment, so they just never get it back. For decades, the government seemed pretty happy with this arrangement, and it was one thing that was helping, in a small way, to keep federal entitlement programs solvent. Now, however, the IRS has been asked to turn this data over to the Trump administration's ICE agency to help identify and deport undocumented workers. So yes, undocumented people do use public services, at least some of them, but it's incorrect to assume that they aren't also helping to pay for them. One of the biggest controversies historically about the impact of undocumented migration has to do with its impact on jobs and wages. Employment is the primary pull factor bringing migrants to the United States. It always has been. It's what brought my German and Scottish ancestors to the United States over 100 years ago. Undocumented people work in the United States, an estimated 8.3 million do, and immigrants as a whole are well represented across industries. Foreign-born men, 77%, are more likely to be in the labor force at any given time than native-born men, 65.9%. For women, it's more equivalent, though foreign-born workers work longer hours on average and make less money. Migrant workers are hard workers and often bear the burden of needing to cover costs in the host country, as well as putting aside money to send back to loved ones in their home country. These payments, called remittances, can be a lifeline to family in the home country, as well as to those countries' economies. Global remittances account for about 4% of the GDPs of low-income countries, according to a study conducted by the IMF. Undocumented workers make up only about 5% of our total workforce, but they tend to be heavily overrepresented in certain industries. For example, undocumented people are estimated to make up over 40% of farm laborers in the United States, close to a quarter of construction workers, and about 20% of housekeepers and landscapers. In some states, of course, this is higher. About half of all construction workers in Texas are estimated to be undocumented. The reliance on Mexican and Central American workers, especially in food production, isn't new. Even during eras when laws were passed restricting the entry of other migrant groups, the Chinese, Eastern, and Southern Europeans, lobbying from employers kept the U.S.-Mexico border open. During wartime, when the mass mobilization of young working men left critical labor shortages, The U.S. government often actively recruited workers from Mexico to meet demands. During World War I, employers recruited Mexican workers to come to the U.S. to pick crops. After the war, when the economy crashed during the Great Depression, government officials launched immigration raids on Mexican neighborhoods, rounding up and deporting en masse both Mexican nationals and some U.S.-born citizens who couldn't prove their identity in time. When World War II started, the pattern repeated itself. The U.S. needed workers to plant and harvest crops and work in factories, and the government again turned to Mexico for help. Enter the Bracero program, bracero meaning manual worker. The U.S. and Mexico contracted to recruit 4.6 million Mexican workers and sign them to labor contracts in the United States. They were then transported to job sites in the U.S. in caravans of canvas-covered pickup trucks and trains. Being a bracero wasn't an easy life. You were assigned to an employer and contracted to work for him, so you weren't free to look for better wages or conditions elsewhere. Some braceros jumped their contracts and looked for work other places. Other people simply cut out the middleman, traveling to the United States themselves and finding work where they wanted. Still, the U.S. seemed grateful for their help. This wartime propaganda poster, in English and Spanish, celebrated the braceros' contributions while reminding everyone that whether they were from Mexico or the United States, we were all Americans. President Roosevelt likewise praised the braceros, noted, "Mexican farm workers are contributing their skill and their toil to the production of vitally needed food." But then the war ended. Fighting men returned and wanted jobs. Some native-born U.S. resented or distrusted their new neighbors. 1950s America was still a time of legally sanctioned racial segregation. Tolerance of cultural, ethnic, and linguistic differences weren't always encouraged. And so this happened. In 1954, 12 years after the beginning of the Bracero program, the government launched an initiative called Operation Wetback. That was its real name. Wetback is a slur ostensibly referencing someone illegally entering the United States by swimming across the Rio Grande River. To call former braceros wetbacks is dehumanizing and also patently false. They did not enter illegally, they were invited, and they did not swim. They were driven in trucks and on trains. Nevertheless, there followed a series of quasi-military raids in Mexican neighborhoods, followed by the arrest and mass deportation of approximately 1.1 million people, including some native-born citizens. At that time, many people were born at home, and so official birth certificates proving citizenship weren't always available. Many of the people taken were deported to extreme southern parts of Mexico to prevent their easy re-entry. The impact of this historical reliance on foreign-born workers has on Americans is mixed. We'll talk about the effect on jobs and wages in a second. First, I want to address the effect on prices, which tends to be more positive for U.S. consumers. Having a large, lower-paid force of people who are willing to do hard, hot, dirty jobs like harvesting our fruit or mowing our lawns certainly brings down prices. It leads to something economists actually call the illegal worker discount, which is what it sounds like. This isn't always very much. It can range from just a few pennies off of a bag of apples at the supermarket to $1 or $2 off the cost of a dinner out, to a few $1,000s off the cost of a new home due to cheaper construction costs. But over the course of an entire month or year, those pennies and dollars add up. A 2024 study estimated that total deportation of 8.3 million workers would represent a jump of almost 10% in the Consumer Price Index by 2028. The Consumer Price Index is a way of measuring inflation that looks at the cost of a market basket of goods, ranging from food, clothes, rent, automobiles, and so on. Some goods probably wouldn't be affected much at all, but industries like farming and food service that rely more on undocumented workers would see more of an impact. If nearly half the farm labor force were removed, we would likely see both shortages and significantly higher food prices, though that too depends on the crop. Crops like wheat, which are more heavily mechanized, might be more stable. Crops that are more labor-intensive or must be tended or harvested by hand, fruits and vegetables, milk and dairy products, would see more change. In 2015, Texas A&M published a paper noting that the dairy industry, producing milk, cheese, and butter, employed a particularly high percentage of immigrant workers, and estimating that the cost of a gallon of milk at the grocery store would almost double if they disappeared. Despite all of this, our heavy dependence on unauthorized workers is a problem. Undocumented workers are easier to exploit and underpay than legal migrants or citizens. They work longer hours for lower pay and in sometimes brutal conditions. Some may be trafficked, forced into slavery either in sex work or a range of other kinds of work. Agricultural work, as stated, is one place where a disproportionate number of undocumented people work, and also a place where protections for them are particularly lacking. In most of the rest of the labor force, laws forbid hiring children under the age of 14 and restrict children under 16 from working more than a certain number of hours weekly. Children under 18 are barred from doing hazardous work. But farm work is different, perhaps harkening back to a time when most of our food was grown on family farms and children worked alongside their parents. Labor laws still allow much younger children to work in farm settings and allow them to do hazardous work at younger ages. On farms, it is legal to employ children as young as 12 during non-school hours, and younger children under certain circumstances. We don't know how many children between the ages of 10 to 17 are working to put food on our tables, but a significant number of them are no longer working on small family farms. Rather, they are first or second generation migrants, laboring, often alongside their parents. Many of these workers do not settle in one community. Rather, they work as itinerant or migrant farm workers. Often these are whole families who may start the season picking avocados in Texas and then end it 6 months later harvesting apples in Michigan. For children, this nomadic lifestyle brings particular challenges. Many drop out of school because of frequent moves or missed school days. Labor is backbreaking work, and farm work can be very dangerous because of the need to work around heavy machinery or in fields treated with heavy doses of pesticides. This aspect of the immigration debate is often missing from political discourse on the subject, in part because these workers are somewhat hidden. But I think it's fair to assume that, regardless of whether you're more conservative or more liberal on the issue, none of us want our food to be grown by people who are being harmed, especially if those people are children. What impact does this all have on U.S. workers? One of the biggest pushbacks against migration historically, and now, comes from native-born workers who worry that immigrants will either take their jobs or depress wages because of their eagerness to do any job, even for less money. Survey data indicates that most Americans do believe that undocumented immigrants mostly fill jobs that American citizens don't want, 75%, and also agree that legal immigrants mostly fill jobs that American citizens don't want, although at a lower rate, about 61%. So what impact does immigration have on U.S. workers? Can immigrants displace native workers or cause wages to fall? In some industries, yes, though the data are mixed. Negative impacts from an influx of migrants is most likely to be felt by the lowest paid workers in the U.S. economy, people with high school diplomas or less. This makes sense because they are more likely to be competing for jobs in fields like construction or food service. This probably also helps to explain why Donald Trump's message resonated more with these voters, working class voters and those without college degrees. These groups supported President Trump at higher rates, potentially due to his promises to deport undocumented workers and expand blue-collar jobs. Large influxes of professional immigrants can also cause effects for U.S. workers in some fields, nursing, computer programming, etc., though data show weaker effects here. For higher income workers, the benefits tend to outweigh the detriments, at least statistically. They benefit from cheaper goods and services, as well as general economic expansions that co-occur with migration. This could help to explain why these groups, statistically, were more likely to back Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in the 2020 and 2024 elections. Part of the logic behind the second Trump administration's mass deportation push is the belief that, once undocumented people are gone, unemployed Americans will rush to fill those jobs. On July 8th of 2025, U.S. Secretary of Labor Brooke Rollins defended both deportation and cuts to programs like Medicaid, which in Texas often go by names like Star Health or CHIP, arguing that 34 million of the U.S.'s 80 million people who receive some kind of Medicaid health insurance coverage were, quote, able-bodied adults who could move into farm jobs instead. As of September of 2025, our unemployment rate is 4.3%, meaning about 7.4 million Americans are out of work. There are complicated factors to those people just picking up and taking over farm jobs, though. For starters, the U.S. population is very urbanized. Most of us, about 80%, live in cities. Farm jobs are usually not in cities. They're in rural areas, hours away from the closest city center. An unemployed city dweller who wants to harvest lettuce or milk dairy cows would have to leave their home and move. They need a car, and they might need to be willing to live as itinerants, following the harvest from place to place, because hired farm jobs are often seasonal. If they have children, they'd need childcare while they worked very long, which is expensive, and schooling for their children might be impacted if they couldn't stay in one place. They need to be relatively young, healthy, and physically fit. It's unclear how many of our recipients of programs like Medicaid or other welfare support programs would meet all of these criteria. What do you think? Will U.S. workers take jobs as farmhands, construction workers, landscapers, etc., as undocumented workers are deported? Or will U.S. employers have difficulty filling these jobs? Deportations have been high across many past presidential administrations. This 2024 chart from the Brookings Institute compares apprehensions and removals in both border zones and in communities throughout the United States. This last category are so-called interior removals. Even though Republicans have been more likely to campaign on Get Tough on illegal immigration platforms, at least recently, deportations really peaked during Obama. During the same period of time, Obama was trying to push through an immigration amnesty program focused on children brought to the United States as babies. This tactic of trying to extend protections to some unauthorized immigrants while stepping up deportations of others at the same time may have been an attempt to win political support from immigration liberals and immigration conservatives simultaneously, although I'm not sure if that worked. The current Trump administration has made mass deportation a huge priority, however. On July 4th, Independence Day, 2025, President Trump signed what he called his One Big Beautiful Bill Act, officially Public Law 11921. This bill does a lot of different things, but one notable effect is a near tripling of the budget for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. ICE's new annual budget is now higher than the total budgets of every single state and local law enforcement agency in the United States combined. It is equivalent to what nations like Canada, Italy, or Brazil spend on their entire annual military budget, turning ICE into a kind of army in its own right. Whether achievable or not, the Washington Post reported that administration insiders have set a goal of 1 million deportations each year. That well outstrips Obama's highest year, wherein the government deported only 400,000 people. Generally speaking, deportations of people with criminal records tends to be more popular with American voters. And on the campaign trail, Donald Trump asserted that his goal was to get rid of gang members, murderers, and so on. But criminals can be harder to deport, paradoxically, because they're harder to catch. Criminals don't dependably show up for work, school, or even for court appearances, so they can be harder to find and deport. Law-abiding working people may be lower-hanging fruit. So current deportations seem to have skewed toward people without criminal records. From Jan to May of 2025, 67% of people deported by ICE had no criminal convictions on record whatsoever, and an additional 8% had a past conviction, but only for an immigration-related crime, like illegal entry, whereas 25%, a quarter, had some other criminal conviction. All that money being routed to Immigration and Customs Enforcement means the hiring of a lot of new ICE agents, 10,000 or more by the end of last month. It also means the construction of a lot of detainment camps to hold people who are either awaiting deportation or attempting to appeal their cases. About 2/3 of the money will go to that. When Donald Trump was sworn in for the second time in January of 2025, the U.S. had a little over 50,000 beds in its immigration detention system. That was enough to make our immigration detention system the largest in the world. But that figure is on track to double to 107,000 beds. For some, this represents a business opportunity. Approximately 90% of people in ICE custody at any given time are held in facilities run by a private or for-profit correction and detention company. These companies are what they sound like. Two of the largest, CoreCivic and the Geo Group, take a certain amount of money from a federal, state, or local government to incarcerate or detain people, either for the duration of a criminal sentence in the case of a jail or prison, or for immigration detainees whose asylum or deportation cases are pending. CoreCivic's website describes it as providing, quote, criminal justice real estate solutions that better the public good. Using for-profit facilities to house immigration detainees isn't new. It was done under past administrations, both Republican and Democratic, as far back as the 1980s. But the planned expansion of ICE detention does represent a major financial opportunity for these firms and their shareholders. Both CoreCivic and Geo Group are publicly traded companies, meaning you can buy stock in them, and they are seemingly pretty bullish on what this expansion of ICE's holding capacity means. According to reporting in the Missouri Independent, in earnings calls earlier this year with stockholders, both Geo Group and CoreCivic officials described the current landscape as one of unprecedented growth and opportunity. Alongside detention expansion, executives said, they expect profits from increased demand for transportation and electronic monitoring services. Some ICE facilities are run and administered by government agencies too. One such center, the so-called Alligator Alcatraz Detention Facility, originally known as the South Florida Detention Facility, is being expanded from 3,000 to 5,000 beds. The center has been the source of a great deal of controversy, in part, though not exclusively, because detainees have alleged that the living conditions inside the newly expanded facility are unsanitary and inhumane, ranging from reports of being served insect or maggot-contaminated foods to allegation that non-functioning toilets flood cells and floors with human waste. Allegations that spokespeople for the Florida Division of Emergency Management have said were false. Though the term Alligator Alcatraz may originally have been used derogatorily, it's been embraced by members of the administration and immigration hardliners. In June, the Department of Homeland Security tweeted a meme of alligators wearing ice hats on its official X account, while a Republican Florida congressional candidate, Kat Cammack, began selling Alligator Alcatraz merch on her campaign website, shown here. At the time of this recording, the use and construction on the facility is under court challenge for a range of reasons, including environmental concerns over the site's location in the ecologically vulnerable Florida Everglades, objection from local Indian tribes to its location on ancestral lands, and fears over insufficient oversight of detainee health and safety. However, regardless of whether this specific facility continues to operate, other states have begun building similar facilities. Non-citizens detained in removal proceedings have fewer rights than people, either citizens or no, who are charged with a crime and facing criminal charges. People in immigration removal proceedings can be represented by an immigration attorney, but only if they can pay for one. There's no right to a public defender in immigration court if you can't pay. The pace of arrests and deportations has stepped up so much that some people have alleged they didn't have the time or ability to contact their lawyers or family members at all. One example is a newly filed lawsuit on behalf of two plaintiffs, known to the courts as Rosario and Julia. The women, both non-citizens, alleged that they were arrested along with their citizen children, a 2-year-old girl, a 7-year-old girl, and her brother, a 4-year-old boy, undergoing treatment in the United States for aggressive kidney cancer. As citizens, the children would normally have the right to stay, but both mothers alleged they were swept up and deported to Honduras without the ability to contact either their lawyers or family members who might have been able to care for the children in the United States. In March of 2025, a Salvadorian national, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, was arrested and deported to El Salvador, despite a 2019 court order that gave him protected legal status in the United States. Government officials stated that Abrego Garcia's deportation was the result of an administrative error, but also stated that they had rescinded his legal status due to a statement from a confidential informant who claimed he was a member of the MS-13 gang. Abrego Garcia was imprisoned without trial in El Salvador's notorious terrorism confinement center until being returned to the U.S. under another court order. However, shortly after his return, he was slapped with new charges that he was part of a conspiracy to smuggle undocumented immigrants into the United States through Texas. On August 25th, when he showed up for court, he was arrested by ICE again, at which point the Department of Homeland Security put out a press release indicating that it was making plans to deport him not to his home country of El Salvador this time, but rather to the African nation of Uganda, a process called third country removal, traditionally only used when deporting an individual to their home country is impossible, either because it is too dangerous or for some other reason. However, the Trump administration has been utilizing this strategy more as a way to expedite removals, deporting South American migrants to the African nation of South Sudan or Russia, African and Iranian migrants to Costa Rica. This particular strategy has been criticized by human rights advocates because the deported individual often ends up stranded in a country or even on a continent where they do not speak the language, have no ties to anyone, and may not have the means to get home. However, in a June 2025 ruling, the Supreme Court held that the administration can deport individuals to third countries without giving them either prior notice or the ability to challenge their deportation. People who are detained or deported face a range of significant challenges. There's separation from friends and loved ones left in the United States. You lose your job, your kids their school, and possibly you lose your possessions. If you are deported, any property left behind in the United States is still legally yours. However, no longer having the ability to pay car notes, rent, or mortgages can often lead people to lose such assets fairly quickly. And personal things that people don't have time to make arrangements for can end up auctioned or in dumpsters. It's not just material things either. Animal shelters and rescue groups are reporting an uptick in family pets that are being surrendered to shelters, or in some cases just abandoned on streets or left behind in empty apartments when families are abruptly taken into custody. The deported individual will then face return to the circumstances that led them to want to flee in the first place, ranging from poverty to danger. The goal of much of this may be to encourage what is called self-deportation. Self-deportation occurs when an individual leaves the receiving country to avoid formal deportation, or because life there simply becomes too difficult. A family might choose to leave voluntarily so that they have more time to put their affairs in order, to try to rehome their pets, sell cars and other property, arrange for the storage of family mementos, and not end up in a facility like Alligator Alcatraz or facing third country removal. Presumably, it would also act as a deterrent to other people wanting to come to the United States. Customs and Border Protection now offers a free app, which can be downloaded on the Apple or Google App Stores, that notifies the government of your intention to self-deport and promises their assistance, potentially including subsidized airfare and a promised stipend of $1,000. Finally, what do you think? How would you address undocumented immigration if you were a policymaker? What would you do about people and families who are already settled in the United States? Would you pursue mass deportation or open up pathways to citizenship? What about industries dependent on these workers? What would you do about them? This slide concludes this lecture. Thank you for listening.